The door to my office closed with a soft hiss, the kind of sound that feels final, like the last page of a book being shut on your name. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty desk where I'd spent years turning ideas into empires. 10 years of my life condensed into one cardboard box, a photo, a few notebooks, and a pen I once used to sign the company's first multi-million-dollar contract. I wasn't fired for performance. I wasn't fired for failure. I was fired because my office had a better view. They called it a strategic restructure. What it really meant was that the new vice president, a man who couldn't tell a clause from a comma, wanted my floor, my chair, my air, and the board, too eager to impress him during the upcoming merger, gave it to him. It wasn't about space. It was about symbolism. They wanted to show the incoming partners that power had changed hands. That the woman who built the foundation no longer mattered. That they forgot something. I didn't build that company to watch it collapse. And I didn't leave without taking something with me. Something invisible. Buried deep in the very structure they thought they understood. When you spend a decade in compliance and corporate law, you start to see things differently. You stop reading sentences. You start reading silence. The empty spaces between words where real power hides. And when they made me draft the merger's compliance framework, I made sure it was airtight. At least for me. I didn't plan revenge that day. Not yet. At first, I just wanted to understand how people you once mentored could smile while cutting you out. The CFO wouldn't meet my eyes. The HR head mumbled through her speech, pretending this was a restructuring opportunity. Watched them all and realized how fragile loyalty looks under fluorescent light. I packed slowly. Every item I lifted had weight. Not because it was heavy, but because it was earned. The pen, the files, the binder with color-coded tabs, and the memory of every long night spent cleaning up their mistakes. I walked out without a word. No tears, no anger. Just that calm, sharp quiet that makes people nervous. By the time the elevator doors closed, I knew they thought I was done. But what they didn't know was that the compliance protocols they were celebrating, the very ones they needed to close the $250 million merger, had been designed, reviewed, and archived by me. Every clause, every dependency, every timeline. It was my fingerprint on every document, and I knew exactly which pressure points could make the whole deal crumble. Legally, flawlessly, silently. Revenge, I've learned, doesn't need shouting. It only needs patience and paperwork. For the next few days, I watched from afar. The press releases glowed with words like synergy and global potential. They called it a milestone partnership. The CEO, my former mentor, looked radiant in every photo, giving interviews about our dedicated team. My name wasn't even mentioned once. It was as if I'd never existed. That's when something inside me shifted. It wasn't rage, not anymore. Rage burns out. What I felt was colder, sharper, a need for balance, for precision, for justice written in fine print. When you've spent your career ensuring every signature aligns with the law, you learn one thing. Power isn't in ownership. It's in authorship, and every word of that merger, every compliance structure, every legal certification manner was authored by me. They might have fired me from my office, but they were still standing inside my framework. The first whisper of my plan wasn't even a thought. It was a moment. The night I saw a photo of my replacement sitting at my desk, feet up, glass of champagne in hand. The caption read, "New leadership, new energy." I smiled, because energy fades. But paper endures. And soon, that same paper would decide how their empire ends. They wanted a clean start. I'd give them one, in writing. After I left, the company felt like a ghost town I could still walk through with my eyes closed. Every hallway, every meeting room had an echo of my decisions in it. My fingerprints were on everything, the contracts, the policies, the compliance systems that kept the company legal and clean. They could replace my nameplate, but they couldn't erase my signature from the core of their infrastructure. The merger between Altura Dynamics and Vernex. Global was the biggest deal of the decade, two giants combining for market domination. It looked perfect from the outside, shiny, bold, profitable. But from the inside, I knew what kept it fragile. Because I built it. I had designed the entire compliance integration, planned hundreds of pages of cross-border regulations, data handling rules, and ethical obligations. It was a masterpiece of paperwork and precision. I wrote it to be flawless, but I also wrote it to be traceable. A system that could identify who tampered with what. Every edit, every signature, every deviation left a trail, and that trail pointed straight to whoever made the mistake. So when they fired me, I didn't have to hack or sabotage anything. I just left the truth exactly where it belonged. In the system. Waiting. Watching. I kept tabs on the merger progress through public filings and internal whispers. A few of my old team members still respected me enough to send accidental updates. Nothing confidential, just breadcrumbs. I learned that the board had assigned the final compliance sign-off to the new VP, the same man who took my office. His name was Calden Ross. Ambitious. Loud. The kind of person who talked about leadership more than he practiced it. He didn't understand the system he was signing off on. He didn't even realize that half of the automated reporting depended on authorization renewals I alone managed. They had my account suspended after termination, but compliance infrastructure doesn't forget its architect. Without my personal credentials, certain certifications would quietly expire. It wouldn't break overnight. It would rot, line by line, until the merger became non-compliant by its own rules. And in mergers like this, non-compliance isn't a slap on the wrist. It's a deal killer. The irony? They had publicly praised the efficiency and resilience of their compliance architecture, the one I built. And they had no idea that to remain resilient, it required someone who actually understood it. I remember sitting in a cafe near the office one afternoon, laptop open, watching their press briefing live. Calden stood in my old spot beside the CEO, bragging about a seamless transition under strong new leadership. I laughed softly into my coffee. Seamless, I thought, was such an interesting word, especially when you knew exactly where the seams were hidden. I wasn't planning to strike yet. Revenge that early would look like bitterness, and bitterness clouds strategy. I needed timing, a moment when the compliance lapse would matter most, when one missed renewal or one unsigned audit could legally detonate the deal. So I waited. I watched, and I studied their moves like a chess player memorizing an opponent's habits. The board thought they'd moved on from me, but inside that merger, I had left something much better than sabotage. I left ownership. The intellectual kind. Every compliance design, every checklist, every structure carried my digital watermark. It was subtle, but legally valid. A digital signature embedded in the XML files, one that tied the entire compliance framework back to me as its original author. If they ever tried to use it commercially without authorization, it would technically breach both copyright and internal ethics protocols. And the beauty of it? I didn't even have to touch a thing. All I had to do was wait for them to break their own law. Within weeks, I started hearing murmurs. A certification delay, an investor inquiry, a request for updated legal proof of framework ownership. Tiny cracks. I didn't cause them. The system did naturally because it was missing me. My existence wasn't erased, it was embedded, like ink in the paper. Still, patience was the hardest part. There were nights when I wanted to send an email to remind them who had really built their empire. But I resisted. Silence was my weapon now, and silence needs discipline. One morning, I received a message from a junior analyst who had once worked under me. It was short, anxious, and enough to make my heart race. They're asking about your digital authorization key. Calden says he can bypass it. Legal says they can't. It's getting tense. That was the first real sign. They were cornered, and they didn't even know who drew the map. The setup was complete. The trap wasn't in code or sabotage or theft. It was in law, the language they never cared to understand. The language I spoke fluently. Now the merger clock was ticking, and every tick brought them closer to the compliance deadline. They thought they were building an empire. I knew they were building a case. The first headline hit 2 months after I left. Altura Vernex merger faces minor regulatory delays. Minor. They always use that word before something collapses. I sat in my apartment, a cup of tea cooling beside unread books, and watched the CEO's interview. He looked calm, but I could see the tightness around his jaw. That was the face of a man trying to pretend the house wasn't on fire behind him. The issue? A series of compliance verifications that hadn't been renewed under my name. The system didn't recognize the new VP's credentials, because his access level didn't match the framework's author permissions. To fix it, they'd need either a legal override or my authorization key. But my key was personal property under my employment contract, the kind that couldn't be replicated, reassigned, or used without consent. I had written that clause myself, years ago, as protection against data misuse. Ironically, it now protected me. Emails began flooding my inbox. Not from them, but from third-party auditors and partners who remembered me. Hey, could you clarify a few details about the legacy system? We're missing a compliance reference from your version control logs. I didn't answer a single one. Every silence became louder. By week 3, the whispers turned into boardroom arguments. I knew. Because someone in accounting, an old friend, sent me a message that simply said, "They're panicking." The merger contract required full compliance, certification within 90 days of the deal announcement. Without it, Vernex could legally withdraw without penalty. 90 days was turning into 85. Then 79. Called in my replacement, tried to patch things manually, but compliance isn't like code. You can't brute force a system that runs on logic, ethics, and law. Every time he tried to adjust something, it created a new inconsistency. Audit reports began flagging contradictions. And contradictions in compliance mean liability. I didn't have to lift a finger. The system was defending itself, defending me. Then one evening I received a formal email from Altura's legal department. It was polite, careful, and desperate under the surface. "Dear Ms. Lane, we'd appreciate your assistance in transferring certain legacy credentials. To ensure regulatory continuity, your cooperation would be greatly valued." They used the word valued. It almost made me laugh. I reread the message 3 times before closing my laptop. They thought this was still a negotiation. It wasn't. It was a slow realization that the foundation they'd stolen from was still owned by the person they'd discarded. Inside me, something shifted again. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about proof that precision, diligence, and integrity were more powerful than politics and arrogance combined. The next week, Vernex's compliance counsel reached out directly. Not Altura, Vernex. That was the moment I knew the dominoes were truly falling. The acquiring company was beginning to doubt its partner. The message was cautious. "We understand you were the original compliance architect. There appeared to be discrepancies in the current documentation. If you're available for consultation, we'd appreciate clarity." That single sentence carried the weight of everything I'd waited for. They weren't asking for help. They were asking for assurance. And I had all of it, but I wasn't ready to respond. Not yet. The longer the silence stretched, the more valuable my voice became. Days turned into weeks and rumors started leaking into the press. Whispers about authorization disputes and procedural lapses. Investors started asking questions. Vernex's legal team began pulling records. And inside Altura, people started turning on each other. I'd given them exactly what they wanted. New leadership, a fresh image, and a woman erased from the photo. Now they were learning what happens when you try to erase the author of your own survival. They hadn't fired an employee. They'd fired the system itself. And it was about to file a report of its own. By the time the internal memo leaked, the company was eating itself alive. The memo wasn't dramatic, just a sterile, 3-paragraph summary of unexpected compliance, discrepancies, and pending regulatory clarifications. But in the corporate world, that's the language of death sentences. Altura's stock dropped 7% overnight. Vernex suspended due diligence. And by the next morning, the board was holding an emergency meeting, one I wasn't invited to, but I didn't need to be. The aftermath was written all over their faces when the news cameras caught them leaving headquarters. The CEO, Mark Rennick, looked older, smaller. The same man who once called me the engine of this company was now avoiding microphones like they carried the plague. I watched it all unfold from my apartment, fingers around a mug of untouched coffee, and felt that strange mix of pain and peace. It wasn't satisfaction yet, just balance slowly taking shape. By now, Calden Ross had become the scapegoat. The board blamed him for compliance oversight. Failures, he blamed it blamed the legal department. Legal blamed legacy systems. And in a way, they were all right, because the legacy system was the problem. I was the legacy system. Then came the final betrayal, the one that turned my silence into action. That evening, a contact in Vernex forwarded me an internal email thread. Confidential, but clearly written in panic. The CEO himself had authorized a desperate move. Attempt to restore original compliance access by any means necessary. If needed, recreate Lane's credentials to bypass author key dependencies. Keep this internal. In other words, they were going to forge my authorization. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. My name, my system, my code, about to be copied by the same man who once promised I'd always be part of the company's legacy. That line broke something inside me that I didn't know was still holding on. You can take my office, you can take my title, but forge my signature, my identity, and it becomes war. I opened my old private archive, where every compliance clause, every file structure, every ownership certificate still sat in perfect order. Years of work, but now it was evidence. I read through the contract once more and smiled when I found it. Clause 14.6. Unauthorized reproduction or reuse of proprietary frameworks constitutes breach of Federal Data Ethics Act. It wasn't just internal misconduct. It was a criminal violation. The trap had finally closed, and they'd walked right into it. The next morning, I contacted Vernex's legal division, not Altura. I didn't threaten or demand anything. I simply attached proof. Digital signatures, audit trails, authorship records, all showing the compliance framework was legally mine. My email was only 2 sentences long. As the original author of Altura's compliance structure, I cannot authorize the use or reproduction of my proprietary framework under current conditions. Continued application constitutes legal violation under Clause 14.6. That was all it took. Within 48 hours, Vernex froze the merger entirely. They couldn't afford to proceed under legal uncertainty. Shareholders panicked. Investors withdrew. The merger that was supposed to be their crowning achievement was suddenly a liability no one wanted to touch. And the best part? I hadn't broken a single law. They had. When Altura's leadership realized what happened, they turned on each other. The board blamed Rennick for letting me retain intellectual ownership. Rennick blamed HR for not revoking my clause permissions. Calden resigned before he could be fired. In a week, the empire they'd built on arrogance was dust. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even leave my apartment. I just watched the emails pour in. Apologies, explanations, even offers. They wanted to make peace, to discuss restitution, but peace is for equals, and I had already won. The first thing I did after walking out of that office wasn't cry. It was to open my laptop. I knew. Nexura's merger with Hallstrom Group hinged on one thing, compliance clearance. And that clearance had my signature on it, the signature they took for granted. When I built Nexura's internal compliance system 3 years ago, I designed it to flag any document that bypassed dual authorization, a safety net, or in this case, a noose. They'd been routing merger documents through a dummy account after I left, thinking my access was gone. It wasn't. I logged in quietly from a hidden VPN and watched the transaction logs update in real time. The new compliance head, Victor, had been rubber stamping approvals at record speed. No real audits. No independent verification. Just boxes ticked for the board's approval to push the merger. I smiled, sloppy. Then I pulled out the old compliance framework I'd written, the one I'd protected. Under an obscure intellectual clause in the employee handbook, it stated that any regulatory framework I authored without direct compensation remained my intellectual property, meaning if Nexura used it after termination, they'd be in violation of their own policy. I drafted a private letter to the Federal Trade Commission's Corporate Oversight Division. Not a report, a query. Subtle. It simply asked whether Hallstrom's merger filings included independent verification under the 2018 Compliance Modernization Act. I didn't sign my name. I didn't need to. Within 48 hours, I saw the first ripple, an internal memo from Nexura's legal team. Urgent FTC audit notification received. Potential irregularities in compliance process. Perfect, the fuse was lit. Meanwhile, I crafted the next move, the mirror audit. Months before my termination, I had archived a full compliance data set on a private drive. Every internal note, timestamp and transaction path. It was clean, structured, traceable. I sent it anonymously to Hallstrom's due diligence team with one line attached. Compare these records with what you were given. You'll know who you're merging with. By the end of the week, Hallstrom froze all negotiations pending investigation. Nexura went into chaos. My old colleagues started texting me late at night. Whispers of emergency meetings, legal red flags, compliance blackouts. One message simply read, "Did you do something?" No, I thought. I did everything. It wasn't about revenge for being fired anymore. It was about balance, about showing them that you can't erase the architect and expect the building to stand. A few days later, my old boss, Martin, appeared on a webcast interview denying all wrongdoing. He looked calm, too calm, which meant he hadn't found the second trap yet. You see, the real bomb wasn't the audit. It was the clause buried inside the merger agreement, the one referencing legacy compliance, systems as inherited assets. I'd written that line into Nexura's founding documentation back when the company was small. If any of those systems were found to be compromised, every board member who approved the merger could be personally liable. They fired me to save money. Now, every signature they made was a ticking financial liability. The irony? I wasn't even in the room. And yet every pen stroke, every deal, every move they made was still passing through the framework I created. And soon it was going to collapse. Quietly, elegantly, like a legal guillotine. The news broke on a rainy Thursday morning. Hallstrom withdraws from 250 Meter's Nexura merger pending regulatory review. One headline, just one line, and everything I'd built, and everything they'd stolen, came crashing down around them. I watched it unfold from a quiet cafe across the street from Nexura's glass tower. Through the fogged window, I could see the swirl of panic, executives rushing in and out, phones pressed to their ears, umbrellas colliding in the chaos. The very people who'd once looked through me like I didn't exist were now fighting for air in a storm I created. Inside, they were facing the impossible. The FTC had issued an immediate preliminary hold on the merger, citing compliance inconsistencies, missing verification trails, and unresolved authorship claims. That last phrase, authorship claims, was my masterpiece. Martin, the CEO who'd smiled as he signed my termination, was now stuck in back-to-back calls with Hallstrom's legal counsel. They wanted proof of proprietary ownership for the compliance systems in use, but the only proof existed in one place: my digital signature embedded deep inside the framework. When they deleted my access, they assumed it wiped everything. They never realized I'd coded the system to preserve an invisible author hash. My initials, timestamped in every record. It wasn't just proof of authorship, it was legal DNA. By noon, the board had convened an emergency meeting. I watched the live shareholders stream from my tablet, their faces gray with dread. The CFO tried to explain the missing verification logs, the unauthorized data transfers, the anonymous tip that triggered the FTC inquiry. Every word dug them deeper. Hallstrom's representative spoke coldly. Professionally, we cannot proceed under these conditions. This merger would expose us to unacceptable liability. And then came the moment I'd been waiting for. A voice on the call, an FTC observer, and asked, "Who authored the compliance system your merger relied on?" Silence. You could see it in Martin's face. The recognition. The slow burn of realization that the person they erased was the one person who could save them. I closed my eyes and listened. He tried to speak, stumbled, and then admitted it was developed by a former employee who is no longer with the company. The observer pressed. Was intellectual transfer documentation signed and registered with your HR or legal departments? Another silence. That's when the legal director's voice cracked. No, she wasn't compensated for that system. It was internal. The observer paused for a long, terrible moment. Then by default, the rights to that compliance framework belong to her. You've used unauthorized IP in a federal merger filing. I'll never forget the look on Martin's face. That flicker of defeat. The kind that breaks a man from the inside out. By the time the call ended, Nexura's valuation had dropped 43%. Their investors froze funding. Hallstrom officially withdrew their bid. The board issued a public statement, temporarily suspending leadership. Operations pending investigation. In a single afternoon, their empire cracked from within. As I stood outside their building in the rain, the Nexura logo flickered faintly through the glass. I could hear faint echoes of voices. Desperate, pleading, broken. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. My revenge wasn't about gloating. It was about proof. Proof that intelligence outlives arrogance, that silence can be louder than any confrontation, that the woman they thought they could erase had rewritten the ending from the shadows. When I walked away from that cafe, I didn't look back. But somewhere deep inside, I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the start of their downfall, and the beginning of my own reconstruction. Weeks passed before the noise finally faded. Nexura's board dissolved quietly under the weight of investigations. Martin resigned in disgrace, claiming personal reasons. Their stock never recovered. What was once a booming empire of glass and chrome now sat half empty, an echo of arrogance built on stolen work. I never celebrated. I never called the press. I just let it happen. The FTC later reached out, asking to verify authorship for the compliance code. I sent them a signed affidavit. No emotion, no gloating. Just facts. They confirmed my ownership, logged it officially, and that was that. The funny thing about revenge is that people imagine it as fire, something that burns hot and fast. But real revenge? It's paperwork. It's silence. It's watching your enemies choke on the rules they once used to control you. A few months later, I got an email from Hallstrom's legal counsel. They wanted to consult on rebuilding their compliance architecture. Cleanly, ethically from scratch. The contract was worth more than I ever made at Nexura. I hesitated before replying, not because I doubted my skills, but because I wanted to make sure I wasn't walking into another cage. Then I saw their final line. "We value integrity over control." That was enough. I said yes. On my first day, I walked into Hallstrom's boardroom wearing the same navy suit I'd worn the day Nexura fired me. I could almost hear their voices again. The snickers, the fake sympathy, the quiet betrayal. But this time, I wasn't there to prove myself. I was there because I already had. As I connected my laptop and loaded the new framework, I noticed my reflection in the screen. Calm, grounded, untouchable. I didn't destroy them out of hatred. I destroyed them to rebuild myself. To show that revenge doesn't have to roar. Sometimes. It just signs its name at the bottom of the final page. Sometimes I still pass by Nexura's old tower on my way home. The building stands like a ghost of glass. Beautiful from a distance. Hollow up close. Their new tenants stripped the name from the front. But if you look closely, you can still see the faint outline where the logo used to be. That's what arrogance leaves behind. Faint outlines. Nothing real. Nothing lasting. People think revenge is about payback. But mine wasn't. It was about reclaiming the truth. About taking back the part of me they tried to erase. The woman who built their system. Who held their company together. Who they thought was replaceable. What they never understood was that real power isn't in control. It's in understanding where control comes from. And in the corporate world, control comes from documentation, timing, and silence. When I hit send on that final affidavit, it didn't feel like war. It felt like balance, like the world quietly aligning the scales. They fired me for having too much integrity. And in the end, that integrity became their undoing. The world didn't cheer for me. There were no headlines that said, "Woman outsmarts her company." And that's fine, because my revenge wasn't made for the public. It was written in legal ink, buried in code, and sealed inside their downfall. Now, when people ask why I seem so calm, I just smile and say, because I've already seen what silence can do. And deep down, I know this. Revenge doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like peace. The kind of peace you earn when you stop chasing validation and start owning your story. On your own terms. That's the real ending. Not victory, not defeat. Just quiet power. And as I close my laptop each night, I remind myself, they fired me to forget me, but I became the claws that ended them. This is revenge untold, where silence is sharper than any weapon, and every downfall begins with the ones who thought they were untouchable. Don't forget to subscribe, because next time, you'll see just how far one signature can go.